Shalom lekulam and welcome back to another Chain Languages video. My name is Yair and today we're going to continue with the theme of Afroasiatic languages by focusing on yet another major branch of the family. In my last video, I asked you whether I should talk about Chadic or Omotic languages, and most people answered Omotic, so here's the video in response to that. The Omotic languages are the most divergent branch of the Afroasiatic languages and are located in this small area here, mostly in southwest Ethiopia. Yet despite not being widely spoken, there are many Omotic languages, which we'll go through in this video. This map, created by Roger Blench, link in the description, shows a detailed account of the Omotic languages. Wikipedia also shows this less detailed map in Spanish, but it still clearly shows the division between the subgroups, and you can see also how the academic names can differ from the two maps, highlighting how Omotic languages still are not a very solidly defined area within linguistics. Most linguists agree today that the Omotic languages can be split into two major groups, Northern Omotic and Southern Omotic. The southern sub-branch is significantly divergent from the other Omotic languages, raising questions of its relation to not only the Omotic languages but even the Afroasiatic languages. A few linguists have also argued that the Mao languages form their own sub-branch. However, it's more likely this is just due to influence coming from the surrounding Common languages, and even fewer linguists have made the argument that the Dizoid languages are also their own sub-branch, although that looks more unlikely. As I had mentioned in my previous video on Cushitic languages, until the 1970s and 80s, Omotic languages were previously misunderstood for being, quote, West Cushitic languages. However, even into the 1990s, there were some arguments trying to reclassify the Omotic languages as being West Cushitic, whilst keeping the South Omotic languages as the, quote, true Omotic languages. Greenberg made the opposite argument for some reason, stating that South Omotic is West Cushitic while the other Omotic languages are their own branch of Afroasiatic. And as I mentioned earlier, some linguists even go as far to state that the South Omotic languages, or even the Omotic language as a whole, constitute as their own language family unrelated to Afroasiatic, or perhaps instead being part of the proposed Nilo-Saharan language family. Nonetheless, it's clear the situation is confusing. However, the general linguistic consensus is that the Omotic languages are divided as the following. Firstly, the North Omotic sub-branch contains the Kefoid languages, the Yem or Yemsa language, the Bench or Gimira language, the Sara language, the Ometo languages, the Mao languages, and the Dizoid languages. The South Omotic sub-branch contains just the Aroid languages, however, of which there are 5, potentially 6. So in this video, I'm going to dedicate a section to each of these subcategories. Without further hesitation, Yalla matchilim. We will work down the list as presented in the introduction, starting with the Kefoid languages spoken in the highlighted area. The Kefoid languages are associated with the Kaficho people. They are sometimes called the Gonga languages. The Kaficho people come from the historical Kaffa region of Ethiopia, which I learned recently could be one of the plausible etymologies for the word coffee. Etymology aside, the Kefoid languages consist of Kaffa, Shakacho, Shinasha, and Philo, and Bosha, the latter of which is now extinct, but was once the official language of the Kingdom of Garo. The number of speakers are all shown on screen. The following phonology is taken from Kaffa, as it is the most spoken Kefoid language, and as you can see, it makes important use of gemination, at least that's what I get from the symbols showing lengthened consonants. There is also a hunter caste within Kaffa culture called Manjo, who today speak Kaffa, however their variety contains unusual lexical and grammatical differences that has led some to speculate that they might have originally spoken a non-Omotic language and were assimilated into it. Nonetheless, here is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Kaffa, with a translation below for those who need a refresher. With that, however, let us move on to the next section. Next up, we have the Yemsa language, spoken in this much smaller region shown in purple. Yemsa today has 92,000 speakers in this small area, however. Although Yemsa is considered one language, there is a dialect called Fuga, which is divergent and has been argued to be potentially its own language. Yemsa was once the language of the Kingdom of Yama before Ethiopia was unified. Yemsa is also known for having different levels of speech depending on social status, with vocabulary used according to your class. An example of this is shown here, and I will link the larger article this sample is sourced from. However, I don't have a lot more to say about Yemsa, so let us move on to our next language. The next language, Bench, is slightly better documented and is spoken in this highlighted region. The official number for its speakers is 356,490, which feels oddly specific, but that is the total when adding up the overall speakers of the different dialects. The dialects in question are Benchnon, Chernon, and Mernon, and are quite different from each other, but still not widely regarded to be separate languages. Something interesting I found out about Bench is that it has 6 tones in total, which is quite impressive. And here is the phonology of Bench, and as you can see, it features adjectives in non-allophonic variation with their normal counterparts, meaning they distinguish these sounds from one another. Although Bench can be written in the traditional Ge'ez script of Ethiopia, a standardized Latin orthography is now used, which we will be seeing in the following samples. Firstly, we have the numbers 1 through 10, and including 100 and 1000. Next, we have a list of personal pronouns which include honorifics. I don't know an awful lot about Ethiopian culture, but I know it's a very diverse country, not to generalize. However, I'm getting a sense that at least in the cultures in the southwest of the country, social status and caste are a very important thing, as it's noticeable across the languages we have looked at so far. Bench also distinguishes between inclusive and exclusive we, which I find a very useful feature that more of the world's languages should use in my opinion. Here are a couple of example sentences from Wikipedia, but if you want a longer sample, I pulled out this sample from a website on Bench culture and language that I will link below. However, that's all for Bench, so let's continue with the video. The next language is Sara, and yes, despite that spelling, it is pronounced with an S. It is located in this small area here. Sara has 13,000 speakers, making it a very small language. In fact, it is only spoken in just 3 villages. Most of the speakers are also bilingual with Omotic languages, which we will speak about in the next section. Something interesting I found out about Sara is that it has 7 grammatical cases, which is impressive as Proto-Afroasiatic is not thought to have that number of cases. Sara also has a fairly interesting phonology, featuring this rare sound, which we actually saw in the last video, called the voiced bilabial implosive. Sadly, I don't have a lot in the way of samples for Sara, except this table of personal pronouns and the numbers 1 through 10. I'm trying to spot possible cognates with Semitic languages, but I don't know if words like obda for 4 are just coincidence, or if they are truly related. However, let's move on to the next group of languages. These languages would be the Ometo languages, the largest sub-branch of the Omotic languages both in geographic size and numbers of speakers. When I say the most spoken sub-branch, I mean it. The Wolaita language has 2.7 million speakers, followed closely behind by Gamogofa Dauro, with 2.5 million speakers. Korete has 160,000 speakers, Male has 105,000 speakers, Basketo has 93,000 speakers, Oida has 37,000, Doze has 21,000, Melo has 20,000, Zaise Zegul has 19,000, and finally Kachama Ganjule has 2,800 speakers. Using Wolaita as the main representative for the Ometo languages, we have the following phonology, with a voiceless nasal glottal approximant, a phoneme I had never previously encountered. Wolaita today has a standardized Latin orthography, which can be seen in the following sample, that being the Lord's Prayer, a prayer important to Christians from the New Testament. That's all I have for the Ometo languages, however, so let's move on to our next section. Before we move on to the next section, however, I want to give a special thanks to the members of the channel: Hein Barnavi, Ivan Lewin, Jaden, Jeffrey Schweitzer, Kennedy, Louis Krupp, Mdfh, Miles, Pid, Sly, Socrates, and Yona. If you would like to become a member and watch my videos much earlier than everyone else, as well as participate in the Discord server and gain access to members-only videos, please consider clicking the link in the corner of the screen right now. However, let's get back to the video. The next group of languages we will be covering are the Mau languages, spoken up here between Ethiopia and Sudan, with Ganza being the only Omotic language that is spoken outside of Ethiopia. Also, don't confuse this flag of the Ethiopian region of Benshangul Gumuz with another similar looking flag, very popular on university campuses. Anyway, as I mentioned earlier in the video, the Mao languages might constitute their own sub-branch of Omotic languages. The languages include Seze with 13,000 speakers, Hozo with 6,000 speakers, Ganza in Sudan with 3,000 speakers, and Bambasi with 5,000 speakers overall. The reason the Mao languages are particularly divergent is due to influence from the Command languages, which belong within the proposed Nilo-Saharan language family and could be the topic for a potential future video. The following phonology comes from the Ganza language and contains this interesting phoneme I'd never seen before, which is a nasalized glottal stop, which honestly I didn't think was possible. Finally, I have a comparison table which shows English, Amharic and Oromo on the left, the Mao languages in the middle, and for comparison to show their influence, 4 Command languages are shown on the right. The fact that some of these words are considered somewhat, quote, simple vocabulary, it's possible the Mao languages might have originally been Command languages that became assimilated into Omotic languages over time, but it cannot be said for sure. However, let's move on to another possible separate sub-branch. Those languages would be the Dizoid languages, highlighted in these 3 areas here. These languages consist of Sheko with 39,000 speakers, Dizi with 34,000 speakers, and Nai with 7,200 speakers. As I mentioned previously, the Dizoid languages are also sometimes considered to be their own separate sub-branch of Omotic, but this is not as widely agreed upon as the Mao languages case is somewhat agreed upon. Both Glottolog and Guldaman accept the Dizoid languages as forming their own sub-branch, but I can't seem to actually find the information on why this is the case, as the lexical similarity is recorded as being quite high between Ometo and Dizoid languages. However, I asked ChatGPT and it said phonological innovations seem to be the main reason, but take that with a pinch of salt. The phonology shown here is from Sheko, and as you can see, once again, adjectives are distinguished from their non-adjective forms. Here I have a table of numbers ranging from 1 through 10. For some reason, 2 forms are shown for Sheko, which I suspect to be due to different dialects, although I couldn't find any mention of dialects on their Wikipedia page. It's also worthy to note that Sheko is amongst the few languages in Africa to have 4 phonemic tones. To conclude this section, I have a longer sample of Sheko from Omniglot here with a translation next to it. However, that's all I have for the Dizoid languages, so let us move on to the final section of this video. The final languages I want to discuss in this video are the Aroid languages, also simply known as the South Omotic languages, highlighted in green here. The Aroid languages are agreed to be the most divergent Omotic languages, and consider that the Omotic languages themselves are already the most divergent Afroasiatic languages. The languages themselves consist of Ari with 290,000 speakers, Hamer with 74,000 speakers, Gail with 56,000 speakers, Dime with 11,000 speakers, and Karo with 1,500 speakers. Although it's hard to exactly pinpoint, the contender for the most divergent Aroid language might be Karo, which would mean that it could take the title as the most divergent Afroasiatic language of all time. However, the Aroid languages themselves have all been discussed by linguists to either be, quote, West Cushitic, truly Omotic, a separate language family, or Nilotic. Aroid languages do exhibit influences from Nilotic and Sumic languages, which are thought to both be part of the Nilo-Saharan language family. The phonology shown on screen comes from Ari and features a voiced labial approximant, which isn't super rare, but is pretty cool. Here I have a comparison list of the numbers from 1 through 10 again, showing the Aroid languages, but for a more comprehensive sample from Ari, here is the Lord's Prayer once again. However, that's all I have for the Aroid languages, so let us now conclude this video. Thank you to everyone for watching. Once again, thank you to my members for supporting my channel. I would also appreciate it if you could leave me a like and subscribe to the channel. Please let me know what you thought of the video in the comments below. I'd love to discuss the Omotic languages with you all. However, for now, that's all I have. I hope you enjoyed the video, and until next time, toda raba ve yalla bye.